And I found that, in fact, yes, that people who have what are considered non-standard accents in most countries are less likely to get promoted, less likely to get raises, less likely to get top management team positions. What I found was also that it wasn't just about accent. As I started expanding this work and looking at other signals and perceptions and cues, I found the same was applying to people not getting those outcomes, not getting those raises, not getting those promotions based on things like their gender or their race or their ethnicity or their class or their sexual orientation or their age. I found that time and time again I was able to replicate this based on other perceptions and signals and cues that others had of them. And so then I went and I realized that it wasn't just in the workplace, that when people were seeing these negative outcomes, they would then often, when they were facing glass ceilings or they were facing barriers, that they would then decide to leave and start their own companies. And so I started studying entrepreneurship, where I found that in entrepreneurship, the same things were happening. That people were not getting funding for their ventures, for example, based on things like their race, their religion, their gender, their class, and so on and so forth. That there were so many perceptions that were dictating these outcomes. And so I started getting asked the question, well, this is all very depressing. What can we do about it? Are there ways that we can inoculate against these biases? Are there ways that we can inoculate against these perceptions and these signals and these cues? Are there ways that we can flip these stereotypes to work in our favor so that we can create our own advantage? Knowing that some people naturally have an advantage and others don't, are there ways that we can flip these stereotypes so that we can create our own advantage and create our own edge? And what I started seeing was that a lot of times we present structural solutions. Things like having more mentors, having more women in executive positions, having more diversity, structurally changing the way that we hire, looking at algorithmic solutions, all of those sorts of things. And those things are great. They're not going to hurt. But even within imperfect systems, we need to be able to empower ourselves to flip these stereotypes, flip these perceptions to work in our favor. Because sometimes these structural solutions are either, we've been talking about it for a really long time, decades, about how things need to change and how there's this myth of meritocracy. And so sometimes things change, but not as quickly as we'd like. Or sometimes they change, but not in the ways that we intended them to. Or sometimes they change, but we didn't really intend them to change in those ways. And so we need to be able to, from within, also empower ourselves to be changing even as they're changing from the external, the outside in. And so this book was really about how we can take that notion that hard work alone isn't enough and guide people and redirect people to the perceptions of who we authentically are, so that they're not writing our story, that we're not passively sitting there letting them write our story based on their perceptions, but instead we are able to flip those stereotypes and those stories in our favor so that we're essentially writing our own.